Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to season 6 of Bible Unlocked Live, a place where we can come together to learn about God and the Bible. Our title for season 6 is The Faith That Stands, and we're glad that you're able to come here tonight with us to look at God's Word together. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and ask a question if you have one. We'll get to questions towards the end, and it would be nice if you're able to introduce yourself to us. I'm Jimmy, and I'll be your host for tonight. And tonight we have Jacob, who's a Bible student and is looking to share with us his thoughts on how we know God exists. Jacob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jacob, as was mentioned. I live over in Southern California in a city called Thousand Oaks, where it's beautiful and sunny here. I live here with my wife and my two kids, and the biggest priority in my life is reading the Bible and getting to know and have a relationship with the author of it. So, learning how we can follow the example of Jesus as set in the Bible, develop a relationship with his Father, the God of heaven and earth, the creator of it. And that's kind of a little bit about me.
Great, thanks. Lately, just talking about your subject, and I know this is a little bit different than what you're going to talk about, but the events in the world are really making it clear that God is working in the kingdoms of men. You know, prophecies told us that the things we're seeing around us, the things that are going on in the Middle East and Iran, are all in God's plan, and it's really exciting for those of us who are Bible students to see these things happening. And it's a great time to be either a Bible student that's just starting out or somebody who's been doing it for a long time. So it's pretty exciting. Before we move on, let's talk about our agenda for tonight. First, we're going to have Jacob go ahead and present to us his subject on how can we know there's a God. And then we're going to move on to our segment of the week, which is from the commandments of Christ, and it's about living for God's purpose. And then we'll circle back deeper and we'll do our dig deeper section and we'll ask some questions of Jacob about his presentation. And then we'll wrap it all up by answering any questions that you have. So, with that said, why don't we just go ahead and turn it over to Jacob and he can talk to us about proof that God exists.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. So when we think about the topic about and reasons to believe or evidence that is proof that God exists, obviously there's lots of different things we could look at. Jimmy mentioned the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. When we look at the current events of the world, those can be really motivating and reassure us that things that were prophesied hundreds and thousands of years ago never seemed like these things would happen, but they do happen just the way is described in the Bible. That's a great reason to believe God exists. We have reasons like archaeology. We're uncovering cities and places and memorials of people and places that the Bible has talked about, but for the longest time, we believe those people and places were fact or fiction rather. Um, so there's many different ways and areas in which we can find reason to believe that there is a God. But there's one reason that we want to look at tonight that the Bible actually speaks directly to. It says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, it says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." So, what this Bible passage is telling us is that we can look at creation, at the world around us, the way that it was set up, the way that it was made, and we don't have to wait for a miraculous sign, something out of the ordinary, to see evidence of God's existence. It's saying that we can, in fact, look at the world around us and see absolute convincing evidence for a creator. I want to use kind of a simple illustration. Imagine you are walking deep in a remote jungle and you come across a small and carefully shaped arrowhead. Now, if that was you and you were walking through this jungle and you came across this little arrowhead, the stone arrowhead, I don't think you would hesitate. You wouldn't debate whether it showed up there by erosion, whether random earth pressures formed it just the way you found it. I think immediately, if it were you or I, we would recognize some intention behind this stone arrowhead. Right? We look at the symmetry of it, we look at the sharp edges, at the front, and we look at the purposeful design, and it would tell us that intelligence was involved, that another human being had been there at some point in the past. And if it was me and I found something like that, I'd be pretty excited, and I would probably be prompted to look for more evidence for human existence there, for whatever individual had created that little stone arrowhead, for example. So I think that we instinctively understand that when we see something structured, when we see something ordered a certain way, and that it has a function, it points beyond itself to a designer. So some thought has been put into it, to say the least. So what I want to do just for a few minutes tonight is kind of start to look at some of the things that humans have observed that are kind of like that arrowhead, things that we've observed that are clear signs that point to a creator, that point to a God. And as we explore, I really think that we will see those words of Romans 1 verse 20 ring very true. Before we go any further, I do want to just say at the outset, this is not at all meant to be a technical science lecture, mostly because I'm by no means a scientific expert. My understanding of science is relatively elementary. I did school and nothing beyond that as far as science goes. So the goal tonight isn't to dive into complicated theories. It's not to debate the truth of some versus the fallacies of others. Instead, what we're going to look at are some examples in creation that are widely recognized and broadly accepted. Things that scientists generally agree exist and operate the way that we observe them to be. So rather than focusing on the technical details, we'll kind of step back and look at the bigger picture. We'll be able to observe on a bigger scale some of the remarkable systems and patterns that we see in the universe, in some life forms. And all of these, I really believe, are evidence that points to a creator and the existence of God. So the first one that I wanted to look at is the topic of cosmology. So cosmology is the branch of science that studies the universe, and it tries to understand its beginning. Now, the vast majority of the study in cosmology tells us that the universe does not appear to be eternal, from whatever angle you look at it from. It had a beginning. And this isn't just a philosophical opinion. It's not a religious claim. Today, about 98 or 99% of scientists agree that the universe has to have had a starting point, based on many factors of its current existence. And so the real debate there amongst scientific professionals isn't whether the universe began, but about when it began and how that happened. One of the clearest pieces of evidence for the universe having a beginning is that it is always been expanding. For as long as we've been observing the universe, it has been expanding. So galaxies are moving away from each other, as they always have. And the further we look into space, the more we see that same pattern, that everything is spreading apart constantly. So when you stop to think about that, it leads to a pretty major implication. Because if the universe is larger today than it was yesterday, and yesterday it was even a slightly bit smaller, go back another day, smaller still, eventually, if you keep rewinding the clock, you eventually arrive at a moment where everything, scientifically speaking, converges. And that's why so many scientists believe the Big Bang Theory to be the most probable explanation, because it's a theory where everything converges into one, and there was a bang of sorts, and from there, the universe began and started expanding. But while science can trace the expansion of the universe back in the general direction of a starting point, it cannot explain what causes or what process ultimately brought space, time, and matter into existence in the first place. And that raises, of course, a big question. It's kind of the question that these scientists have been looking for and are still looking for. If the universe had a beginning, what brought that beginning into existence, or what caused it? Well, does this maybe point to the existence of God? Because that is the explanation that the Bible has always given, right? And it satisfies the obvious need for a cause and a source for the universe. There's a passage that I think really describes how the universe came into being very simply. It's directly related to this issue. It says, "By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible." So that means the things that are visible to us, things like stars, planets, galaxies, every element of creation on Earth, it was formed out of nothing. It's something that is not visible to us. That really is describing the God that brought them into existence. We have another passage, John 1, verse 3. It says, all things were made by God, and without him was not anything made that was made. And this idea of something being made, the word means to bring into existence. So it's like this initial creation is what it's talking about. So science points us clearly toward a beginning, but it cannot ultimately identify the cause behind it. And that's not a criticism of science whatsoever. It simply reflects the limits of what scientific methods are able to investigate. And this is where I think Scripture's explanation carries some weight because it offers an answer to the very question that science itself brings us to ask. Well, what about the fine-tuning of the universe? Because this is in some ways even more astounding because this is a little bit more of a graspable topic than just talking about the universe as a whole. Because I know the universe is something hard to even comprehend. But what about the fine tuning of the universe? Elements that we're maybe a little bit more familiar with. We've been able to observe that the universe does not appear to be life permitting just by accident, because no matter what way you look at it, it appears to be calibrated precision. I want to look at a couple examples of that calibrated precision. If we were to look at gravity, again, it's a bit of a bigger concept, but the strength of gravity did not have to be locked into one possible value. It could, in theory, be stronger or weaker, but it's set at a very specific level, a breathtakingly precise level. If gravity were even slightly stronger or slightly weaker, the consequences would be catastrophic. And professionals have done the calculations on like the domino effect of what happens if gravity were stronger or weaker. And it's major things like stars wouldn't exist because they'd either burn out or they would never ignite. We're talking about planets spiraling into suns and planets colliding or drifting off into frozen nothingness. Atmospheres like the protective one we have around our planet would escape into space, and the list goes on. But I want to just kind of zoom in on one of the elements that would be drastically affected were gravity to be just 1% stronger or weaker. And that's the oceans. Obviously, the oceans make up a major part of the surface of Earth. But what would happen to our oceans if gravity were just 1% stronger or 1% weaker? Well, if it was stronger, oceans would be pulled more tightly towards Earth's center. So the tidal forces would become quite extreme. Coastlines would experience dramatically stronger tides as a result of that, which would cause a lot of the life systems in the reefs and the shores to be compromised. Increased pressure at ocean's depths would dramatically alter marine ecosystems down deeper. And weather patterns across the entire globe would shift due to those changes. Evaporation would change, the circulation of the ocean would change. So pretty big implications. Same thing if it was weaker. Water would not be held as tightly to the planet. And it's calculated that if gravity was 1% weaker, then in a period of time, there'd be no more water vapor left on Earth. It would all be lost. Oceans would gradually thin, tides would weaken, disrupting circulation, oceans would become stagnant, and then again, the climates would be destabilized as well. So those are just some of the bullet point, like quick view aftermath if gravity were to be stronger or weaker. There's many other things that would suffer, not to mention the cascading effects of just the effects directly on the ocean. Now, while there are many theories, there is no clear explanation in science for how we landed on such a uniquely perfect environment for consistency, for longevity, and one that just so happens to support life so perfectly. But what is the supporting explanation put forward by the Bible? Well, we just talked about the various ways that the oceans could have been affected had gravity changed. But look how specific the Bible is about why the oceans are the way they are. This is talking about God. It says, who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth out of the womb. When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band. This is talking about the atmospheres that God specifically designed, the clouds, and prescribed limits and set bars and doors, and said to the oceans, thus far shall ye come and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. So the way that gravity controls the oceans is exactly how God said he set it up to be. He set borders on how far the tides could move, on where the atmospheres would sit, all these different elements that are perfectly balanced because of things like gravity and all the other contributing factors, which of course a creator would have very specifically fine-tuned. Well, we could also reference the absolute precision of the placement of Earth and the vastness of the universe in our solar system. Probably going through school, we all learned about the Goldilocks zone in our solar system, right? Not too hot, not too cold. There's one spot in our solar system where a planet like Earth could exist where life would be supported. And that's just the beginning. Our planet is also perfectly positioned with things like moons to stabilize it so it doesn't do wild tilts, magnetic fields, which block radiation, which would be deadly otherwise. We have tectonic plates that regulate carbon, maintaining our climate and Earth's temperature. We have a perfectly balanced atmosphere that lets in light, that lets in warmth, but it blocks lethal rays. So if you remove any one of a laundry list of these elements, life would be impossible. And there are hundreds and even thousands of these finely tuned elements that come together into specific accuracy in order to make it possible for life to exist. And when we take these together, they really point to the fact that Earth is uniquely and precisely intended for life. There's way too many things that line up just perfectly for it to have been intended for anything other than life. And that's exactly what the Bible has claimed. Isaiah 45, verse 18, God says, for thus says the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. So God says, yes, of course you're going to find a number of elements finely tuned for the sole purpose of supporting life, because he says that's exactly what I created it to do. That was my purpose. So no wonder all these different elements allow it to do just that. Now, I want to kind of zoom in on one example, on one specific or a couple life forms that we find on the planet that I find just to be amazing. And it's an example within the animal kingdom of obligate mutualism. Now, obligate mutualism is the relationship where two species are so dependent on each other that the one cannot survive without the other specific species. So these are not like casual partnerships that happen out of convenience. These are systems that are synchronized down to every last detail. And for me, being someone who really loves nature, who finds it interesting to learn about and to observe, this is the kind of thing that really speaks to me of intention, precision, and creativity. So the example I wanted to look at of obligate mutualism is the relationship between fig trees and fig wasps. So just to kind of build the picture out a little bit here, a fig fruit is not really a fruit in the way we normally think of fruit. What we call a fig is essentially an inverted flower. So the inside of the fig is actually like the flower petals and the pollens. So the flowers are internal, meaning they are completely sealed off and hidden from the outside world. What this means is that typical pollinators, so our bees, our butterflies, all those types of insects, can't access them. Now, the way that plants work is that those flowers need to be pollinated in order for the next generation of fig trees to germinate and to grow. So how then does the species of fig trees continue on if none of our typical pollinators can pollinate the fig fruit? Well, the fig tree relies on a very specific insect for pollination, and that is the fig wasp. So just to give you a very the Coles notes on how this process works. So the fig wasp, the female, enters the fig through a very small naturally occurring hole. It's so small that as she squeezes in, her wings will usually fall off. And once that fig wasp is inside, the eggs are laid. And at the same time, that process pollinates the fig. So that's how the fig is pollinated and allowed to grow the next generation. Once those larvae develop and hatch, the males hatch first, and their job in their life is basically to dig a wider opening out of that fig, and then they die as soon as that job is done. Then the females hatch, and they are able to exit the fig flower, fig fruit with by the hole that was dug out by the males, and then they fly on, find the next fig tree, and the process continues. So that is the life cycle of the fig wasp as well as the fig tree. Now, for anyone here who likes figs, I hope I didn't ruin figs for you. But what I think makes this relationship so interesting between these two species is that there are between 700 and 800 different types of fig trees. So almost every variation, so there's about 750 different variations of fig trees. Almost every variation has their own specific species of fig wasps that it needs specifically to be paired with for reproduction. One type of fig wasp is not able to function and reproduce using that other type of fig tree. There's a specific fig wasp for every specific fig tree, which I think is incredible. The species of wasps and the trees have to line up with the flower pollination. They must align with the wasp's life cycle. The structure of the fig must allow entry of the wasp. All these different factors come into play. And this is basically what biologists call obligate mutualism, a relationship in which both of those organisms rely on each other to complete the life cycle to exist. There's actually a number of different examples of obligate mutualism within creation. There's a list of some of them on the screen. There's a much longer list you could find with some time spent on the internet. But it's super interesting to go and observe these things. And when we do that, it raises the question that how do two entirely distinct organisms develop such tightly coordinated systems where the existence and the survival of each completely depends on the other and vice versa? And I think when we step back and we consider that examples like this exist not just once, but throughout creation, it really invites us to reflect on whether such intricate coordination points beyond itself, just like Romans 1 verse 20 says, right? The evidence that we have in creation points to a creator and should inspire us to think in that direction. Even when we look more broadly at all life on Earth, right? You could look at the interdependence of plants and animals. Plants produce oxygen. They produce food for animals, shelter for animals, protection. Animals, in response, pollinate plants. They disperse seeds. They enrich and manage soil for the plants. And the various ecosystems rely on countless of these interlocking systems. And these systems suggest very strongly a simultaneous beginning, right? It's difficult to imagine any stretch of time where only part of creation existed without the rest, because we see how interdependent it is on each other for the survival of life. And the balance that we observe today in creation only works because all the essential components exist together at the same time. Well, what does the Bible present as an explanation, and does it satisfy this dependence? Well, if we were to start reading the Bible in Genesis 1 verse 1, it would say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we could keep on reading, and for the next 3 chapters, it would describe in detail how God created all of creation within a 6-day period. And yes, it takes a step of faith for sure to believe in a God who has the power to do that all in 6 days. But a 6-day creation period is the explanation that is needed to satisfy the interdependence of the ecosystems, right? Based on a 6-day creation period, no plant or animal existed longer than 24 hours without the other, right? Which is what is required for life. Imagine you God created plants, and then 10 years later planted animals. The plants could never survive without the pollination and the soil cultivation of the animals. There's certain species of animals that only live for 2 to 3 day life cycles. And going by the creation account, they would not have existed for more than 24 hours without the other. So this, I think, is one of the undeniable and unavoidable concepts that Romans 1 verse 20 is pointing us to consider when we look at the creation around us, at the world, at the universe, and all the complexities that we can observe there. So Romans tells us that God's invisible qualities can be seen, clearly seen, from what has been made. And I'll just wrap it up here because I know I'm running out of time. But the multitude of physically observable phenomenons are not there to force us into a scientific explanation. But God says that they are done in a way to inspire mankind to look for Him. They are a springboard for faith. They're not a substitute for reading the Bible per se, but they are there because God has said, if you look at creation around me, you are without excuse to think more about me and to look for me and to read the Bible and try and find me and discover um, other ways in which I have revealed myself to my creation. Right? We are inspired to look for the apparent cause and the power behind the things that we can see. So I'll just wrap it up with one more verse from Psalms 19, verse 1, and it echoes this same sentiment. It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hand." So no matter where you look in creation, we're continuing to discover things that make us wonder, how on earth could that have happened unless there was a creator? And that's God's intention behind the whole thing. So I know we're going to talk more about it a little bit later, but I'll kind of leave it there and turn it back to you, Jimmy.
Great, thank you, Jacob. Yeah, that's really awesome. The lesson in the earth and the world around us is apparent, and the more you look, the more you see God and His hand all around us. I remember when I was like 12 or 13 years old, my science teacher asking me a question, or not me, but asking the class a question, and it was, what would happen if ice sank rather than floated? And we kind of started talking about it, and really what would happen is Earth wouldn't exist, right? The ice would fall to the bottom, and then our oceans and our lakes would be solid ice, and there's all kinds of catastrophic events that would happen because of that. And that granular little detail is so powerful when you see like God had a plan, and even down to the freezing of water. And it was funny because at that moment the teacher basically said, "Aren't we so lucky that it floats?" And I was only like 12 or 13, something like that. And I was like, well, I think it's really great that we had a God that was taking care of us. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. We're going to take a minute and shift gears and consider one of the commandments of Christ. And this week, we're going to be looking at the commandment of living for God's purpose.
We live in a world where self is the most important, where day-to-day life is spent indulging in the impulses of our heart, where the highest purpose is to carefully build a meaningful life that one day you can hopefully look back on and find some sense of satisfaction. It's a life built around self and self-purpose. But Jesus taught something radically different. He taught that if you spend your life living for a higher purpose, then everything else will figure itself out. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 4, "Arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, the mind of Christ, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lusts of men, but to the will of God." When Peter says, "Arm yourselves with the same mind," he's calling us to adopt Jesus' mindset, a mindset where he was willing to lay down personal desires in order to live for God's will. That doesn't mean that our lives become empty or sad. It means that they become aligned with meaning, and aligned with something that lasts far beyond us. Living for the will of God shifts our priorities. Our decisions, our words, and our relationships are no longer driven by impulse, but by purpose. And paradoxically, it's when we stop living for ourselves that life begins to make sense. Once we align our lives with God's will, we suddenly have a purpose in life beyond feeling satisfied on our deathbeds. Matthew chapter 6 says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added unto you." Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll be given a comfortable life and riches in abundance, but it does mean that if we focus on living a life for God's purpose, then the necessities will figure themselves out. Instead of living a life for a sense of self-purpose, we now have a God-given purpose. And that purpose is far better. It encompasses more people than ourselves. It involves a world filled with God's glory and character. And so if we live for that purpose now, then we can have a part in that future to come.
Thanks again to the team for producing that video. If you have any questions you'd like answered, please send them to us. We're always looking for subjects and topics that you find challenging so that we can search them out and find an answer for you. And if you have any of those questions, you can email them to questions@bibleunlocked.com, and we'll put that email address up later in our session this evening. So, Jacob, from wasps to the beginning of the universe, it's really interesting how precise God was in his creation. So, that being said, from what you've shared tonight, do you see that science opposes the idea of believing in God or actually points toward it?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think that's probably one of the age-old questions is do science and the Bible line up? Do they disagree? Science and creationism, however you want to word it. But um, I think in many ways, science has been able to discover a lot of fascinating and incredible elements of creation that has many times actually equipped believers with more and more reason to believe in a God and a creator. Science is excellent at discovering new things and being able to describe, oftentimes, not always, but often being able to describe how those things work and function. Like we have learned a little bit about how galaxies form, how various ecosystems function, how the water cycle works, how physical laws operate. Um, and I think this has given us insight into some of the more intricate parts of the world that we wouldn't be able to have found without them. Um, I think where the two separate more often is where when we start talking about the the origin that those discoveries are attributed to. But I think for myself at least, the more we learn about the universe, the fine-tuning of physical laws, complexity of life, interdependence of various systems and ecosystems, the harder it becomes to see everything as accidental. The more we learn, the more Romans 1 verse 20 rings true to me, that it just inspires me to know and believe and pursue the existence of a God. So I'm not saying they always line up. I don't think they do in every case, but one of the benefits of some percentage of the science that's out there is that it really enlightens us to more complex levels and layers of God's creation and his design.
Yeah, I'd agree. I feel like as science has developed over the years, it's just confirmed more and more what we've learned from the Bible, and it's pretty amazing to see. In terms of asking questions, I just want to remind everybody if you have any questions for Jacob or I, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll do our best at the end to answer them. And I'll give you a question right now for you to think about, and maybe you could respond to it in the chat, and we can see what some of your answers are. Is there something in nature or the universe that makes you think that there must be a creator? So if you have any thoughts on that, something in nature or the universe that makes you feel like, wow, there must be a God, that'd be great for us to see. Jacob, back to you now. If creation is meant to reveal God, why do you think that so many people miss the message and when they look at the universe?
Hmm. So, like we looked at tonight, we have a passage like Romans 1 verse 20 that says, if you look at creation, you should be able to see God. Well, there's also other Bible passages and probably more Bible passages on this topic that talk about where the Bible teaches that human pride and human this desire for independence and even just the desire to explain life from a purely factual point of view can actually cause people to miss what creation is pointing to. Even if you continue reading in Romans 1 verse 20, the following verses warn us about people that will have that perspective where they don't have that humility and that dependence to look for the existence of God. So I think the Bible kind of explains both sides of the coin. I think the problem obviously isn't that God hasn't done a good job of leaving evidence in the world around us, but recognizing that evidence ultimately requires a ready and willing mindset. So you have to be humble. You have to be willing to acknowledge God as a creator. You have to be ready to acknowledge higher power that we maybe have some obligations to, so to speak. So I think the Bible explains why there's both sides to it, and I think it gives us some context there.
Yeah, I really like that answer. The idea of coming to it with humility and the ability to see things from a different perspective are important, and it's what God asks of us, right? To have an open heart and mind, to accept the things that are taught to us in Scripture. Well, that being said, for someone who's skeptical, right, who hasn't really decided to open up their thought process to God, and they're unsure about God, what would you encourage them to observe or think about in terms of nature and the things around us to help them with that?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential, a lot of very good answers that could come from that question. A lot of good things in nature that you could observe. Probably the things that are less impacted or touched or altered by humans would definitely be the most direct way to observe God in creation. But I think there's probably even a better answer to that question, which is if there was one thing you were to think about and to look at and to ponder in order to start knowing more about God, I think it would really be the Bible. Because it has all the evidence, it has all the answers. And I think the way that God presents creation is that creation inspires us and helps us um, acknowledge that there must be a God, and then that kind of is the accountability to push us to look for Him in our life. And the most direct way to do that is to read His Word, where He has physical words that He's left for us. So I think if you're reading the Bible, you're already one step ahead because you can get right to the most direct source, and probably the biggest impact from God is reading His Word.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I agree. I think seeing once you start to read it, you start to see more and more, right? The
Mhm.
more engaged you are with the scripture, the more you can see God in our lives, and I think that's a really uh, good point, and it really kind of puts an exclamation mark on our story for tonight. Um, Going to the answers to the questions. Let's see, we got a few answers here. Uh, the molecular machines and cells, the amazing detail and everything. I think that's a great answer. Like, I remember when I was studying the cell, the thing that really made me believe, not believe, but was amazing to me was the Golgi apparatus, which is pretty cool little piece of a cell. We also have everything that we're starting to learn about DNA, which is so much more complex than computers. That's pretty amazing too, right? The all of the different things that are inherent in our DNA and what makes us who we are and what we are, and it's so much more complicated. He says it's so much more complicated than computers, and there's no way it could be by accident.
Yeah, and
One thing
it's
for
interesting.
good.
I was just gonna say, just to add to that, I think I was looking a little bit at the DNA thing, and it's so cool and it's so intricate, and it's so like just astounding to see what they're learning about it. It's so funny that like if you were going back to the example of walking through a jungle and you see this stone arrowhead, you would instantly say someone was here to have left this here. Like someone left their mark on this stone because they made it a certain shape and they sharpened some edges. And you could maybe list like if you were really good at describing things, you could list 50 descriptive words about that little stone arrowhead. And we conclusively will go to the fact that someone left that there. And then we discover something like DNA, and we're talking about thousands and hundreds and millions of ways in which it is so complex and intricate. Like, how much more should that then lead us to saying, yeah, someone must have been here to have made this happen?
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Sometimes we can be so hard-headed, right? Well, and on a simpler side, I'll just add one more thing. And I think we've all felt this, and it's interesting that this connects to the promises to Abraham. If you've ever been in a really dark place at night and looked up at the stars and see just the millions of stars up above, it makes you feel so small and so insignificant. And just that internal feeling that there must be God who created such an immense amount of space and so many things. It's just really hard to deny when you find yourself in that place. So, yeah, really great subject. Thank you for your responses, everyone. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening and Jacob for presenting tonight. We hope to see you all again next week as we consider our next subject, which is why does God allow suffering? Once again, if you have any questions, you can email them to questions@bibleunlock.com, and our goal is to help you understand the Bible